This lesson is working with tables. In this lesson, you'll learn how to import tabular data that originated from a spreadsheet into a table in Dreamweaver. You'll also take a look at a few techniques for modifying tables, as well as styling tables in CSS. Before we begin, you should create a Dreamweaver site for the DW09 Lessons folder. Once that site is created, we'll have access to the files we need for our lessons. The first file I'd like to point out is the file temperate_zones.csv. This file was created in a spreadsheet application and exported as a comma-separated values file. Dreamweaver cannot work directly with CSV files, but we can import them to create tables. There are a number of different file formats that you can export from spreadsheet applications. For now, if I go into Microsoft Excel, we can see the table that generated our CSV file. We have 3 columns, one for zone, one for Fahrenheit temperatures, and one for example cities. From Excel, we could export this file as a CSV file, or as a tab delimited file, or in any other file format. I simply wanted to show you what the file looks like in Excel, so now I'm going to close the window and return to Dreamweaver. Here I've opened tips.html, and this is the file that we'll use to add our tabular data from the temperate zones file. We can insert tables in a number of different ways in Dreamweaver. Before we insert our table, let's place our cursor at the end of our paragraph and press return or enter to begin a new paragraph. If we were creating our table from scratch, we could choose Insert Table. However, we have a file of tabular data, so instead we'll go to File, Import, Tabular Data. From this dialog box, we'll browse to our Temperate Zones CSV file in our DW09 Lessons folder. And from here, we can choose how our data is delimited within our file. This does require that you know a little bit about the data file that you're working with. Ideally, you've already exported it from a spreadsheet program such as Excel. There are a number of delimiters we can choose from: tab, comma, semicolon, colon, and you can even specify a custom one using other. Since we're using a comma-separated values file, we'll go with comma. There are a couple of options for setting the table width. By default, we can fit our table to the data, or we can choose the width of our table by clicking the Set to Radio button, providing a value, and choosing either percent or pixels. For example, we might choose 75%, or we might choose the width in pixels and set the value to 600. For now, we're going to go with Fit to Data. Additionally, we can set other properties for our table, such as cell padding and cell spacing, the border, and how to format the top row. One thing to point out here is that even though cell padding and cell spacing have no values, this does not mean cell padding and cell spacing will result in 0. Cell padding and spacing will take the default size, typically 2 pixels. So to ensure that we have 0 pixels of cell padding and cell spacing, we'll enter 0 for both of these values. Also, because we want to format our table with CSS, we're going to change the border to be 0 as well. From Format Top Row, we could choose Bold, Italic, or Bold Italic. We're going to go with the default of no formatting, because again, we will use CSS to style our table. With our options selected, we can click OK, and our table is inserted into Dreamweaver. Because we set cell padding, cell spacing, and border to 0, our table looks a little cramped. We're going to address that by setting up some CSS styles in just a moment. But before we do that, let's take a look at how we can work with our table within the Dreamweaver interface. If I place my mouse cursor inside of a row, I can select individual cell and column data. If I hover my mouse cursor on the left edge of the table, my cursor will turn into an arrow, and the row will be highlighted, indicating I can select this entire row. I can also choose an entire column by hovering over the column until the column highlights in red. If I click away to deselect the column, I can also position my mouse between 2 columns until I get a resize handle, and I can shift and drag to resize the entire column. The same can be done with rows. If I hover my cursor between 2 rows, I will get a resize handle and I can adjust the height of the rows. I can also modify the table. For instance, if I wanted to put an empty row beneath our heading row, I'd simply click in our heading row, go to the Modify menu. In the Table menu, I can insert rows or columns, delete rows or columns, or increase the row or column span. The option I use most often is Insert Rows or Columns. From here, I can choose to insert either rows or columns by choosing the different radio buttons. I can also specify where I want the rows or columns to be inserted. When using rows, I can choose to insert the row above or below the section. When using columns, I can choose to insert a new column before or after the column. Additionally, I can add one or more columns by changing the number of columns. What we want to do is add a new row here, so I'm going to again choose rows, and the default value is below the selection. This will insert the new row below the header where we wanted it to appear. When working with tables, you might want to merge rows or columns to create a single row or column. If I click and drag to select my first row, I can also go to Modify, Table, and Merge Cells. This creates the effect of one row that is a single column in width, useful for creating titles or headings for our table. Finally, we can delete rows if we go to Modify, Table, and Delete Row. So these are some of the basic ways to work with tables within Dreamweaver. Now let's take a look at how we might apply CSS styles to our table to improve the overall appearance of it. I'm going to collapse my Files panel by double-clicking it so that I have a full view of my CSS designer. I'll click on Style in the Sources panel, and I'll click on Add New Selector. Because my cursor was inside of a column in my table, Dreamweaver suggests the selector Body Table TR/TD. This rule is a little too specific, so ideally I might remove Body and simply go with Table TR/TD, or I could target just the TR by simplifying the selector to TR, or individual columns by changing the selector to simply TD. What we're going to do instead is create a new class that will allow us to create our style rules, which we can apply to any table. So we'll select that text and replace it with .styledTable. Press Enter or Return, and now we can set our properties for our table. For example, we might click the Background button to display the background properties, and set the background color of our table to white. We can choose the Border button, and in the Border Color field, if we double-click, we can type our border color of #006, which will be a dark blue color. We can locate the border style and set the style to solid. And we can locate border width, double-click on the medium placeholder, and change that to 1 pixel. Next, we can format our fonts, choosing the text property. We'll set the text color to the same value, #006, that we used for the border. For the font family, we'll choose the second to the last option for Lucida Grand. And finally, we'll double-click near Set Font Size and set the font to 10 pixels. Now that we've created our styled table rules, we need to apply that CSS class to our table. We'll click on our table, and in the Properties Inspector, make sure that we're on the HTML properties, and from the Class dropdown, we can now choose Styled Table. Now that we've created our Styled Table CSS rules, we can select our table by clicking inside the table and making sure we choose Table from the tag selector. With the table selected, we can go to the Class dropdown in our Properties Inspector and choose Styled Table. Our table now picks up the white background color, the blue font, and the blue border that we specified in our Styled Table rule. Our data is still pretty cramped inside of our rows and columns, so we could add another selector that will allow us to add spacing between the rows and columns. If I click inside of a row, again choose Style from Sources, and click Add Selector, this time Dreamweaver suggests Styled Table TR/TD. This value is acceptable because I only want to style rows or columns that are within my styled table. So we'll press Enter or Return to accept that value. Then choosing the Layout properties from the Properties panel and scrolling down to Margin, I can click the link in the center of the padding control to link all 4 padding values together. Now, when I set a padding value to say 5 pixels, all 4 of the padding values will be linked and set to the same 5 pixel setting. If I click within Design View of my document, my table now reflects the new settings of 5 pixels of padding in each cell. This gives the table a much nicer appearance. From here, you could add other styles to your table, which is what you'll do when you continue the lesson in the book. So that's it for now. In this lesson, we've learned how to import tabular data that originated from a spreadsheet into a table in Dreamweaver, and we also took a look at a few techniques for modifying tables, as well as styling tables in CSS. This lesson was working with tables.